Hello, and welcome to the show Culture Chat. My name is Dr. Marquita Bird, and my co-host is
Professor Arjun Bakshi.
And we're both faculty members at San Jose State. We thought that we would like to host a show where we discuss social issues and equality issues in the United States so that we can start discussions in our communities and among ourselves and come to understand them better. Today, we're going to be talking about class, a topic that sometimes in America people pretend doesn't exist. So I want to ask Arjun to talk to us about why we're going to discuss class today.
Thank you so much for starting us off. So that's a really good question, Marquita. Why are we talking about class? Well, because we don't like to talk about class, and yet it's a reality. So the perspective I thought I'd bring was of my immigrant experience, being born in the country of India, coming to the United States, and seeing a very different perspective by the peoples of both countries. So where I was growing up, and in many countries around the world, class is a very clear, rigid reality, socially constructed, of course, yet very much accepted by people. And so people affix that label of what class they belong to upon themselves, not just affixed by others on them. And so then the rules of behavior are governed very strictly. Now, when we came to the United States, there was this beautiful narrative. We are all equal, everybody's the same, you're treated per your merit, and that's a beautiful thing. However, is that necessarily to say that there is no class system in the United States? And that was the funny thing. Everyone that I came across certainly seemed to define themselves pretty much being in this large, almost completely endless sense of middle class, despite very big differences in their quality of life, very big differences in their standard on their standard living or their income, or even what kind of work they did. And so the rich were these far and distant group of people far away, and then I don't know, but there wasn't really much discussion on poverty at all, at least in the circles that I was part of. And it seemed somehow to be distanced from reality. So Marquita, what do you think, what is class, how would we even define that term according to you?
That's a good question. We would, and it's a tough question actually, but I would define class as having to do with your social and economic background. We call it socio-economic background. And that has to do with your social status or standing in your community and the amount of money that you have. Of course, class is also marked by the things that you have. It's marked by the opportunities that you have. It's marked by the place where you live. In fact, I just got to reading an article today that said that class can depend on where you live. Yes. When I got ready to move to California, someone was asking me how much money I was going to make, and they said, if you're not making less than $50,000 in California, you're poor. Well, I was coming from Missouri, and I thought, he must be crazy. What, $50,000? That's a lot of money. And I got here and realized that $50,000 in San Jose is poor. People are struggling on $50,000. So it can also depend on where you live. But socioeconomic level, social status, and amount of money that you make tells us about our social class. I, for example, grew up poor. I grew up in a house with 8 people in 3 rooms, no running water, outside toilet. I grew up poor. But now I'm not poor anymore, not according to the Census Bureau. I'm not poor. And I think maybe you didn't come from quite that kind of class background.
No, certainly. I mean, growing up in India, we consider ourselves like anybody else. We were middle class. We had property in the family. There were certain things that were going for us. There was a family business. And over time, you know, people worked hard and progress was achieved. But it was not so much what we saw our class as. It was more what I saw around me, what class was being transacted as. So let me give you an example. Now, when we talk about India and class, one word that always comes to people's lips is it the same as caste? And so let me maybe share the two terms differently. Class, as Marquita correctly defined, is a socio-economic and to some extent legal classification.
Yes.
On the other hand, caste is something that was born of Hindu, shall we say, religion, shall we say philosophy, shall we say culture. It's a little bit moot which of the three brought it along. Regardless, there was a division of labor. What Adam Smith many years called an economic theory division of labor was first created in other countries, such as in this case India, where one section of society would do manual labor, things of building, things of construction, for instance, cleanliness. Another class of society would be the merchant class. They would be the traders, sell you goods, buy and trade. Another class would be the warrior class. They were comprising of the soldiers and in some cases the kings and queens as well. And finally, the last major class was that of the priesthood and scholars. And so what happened over some many generations was around the time of 500 BCE, where the birth of the Buddha took place in not too far from what is present-day India. That is when the level of corruption and exploitation on the behalf of the priesthood in the priesthood caste in India had risen to its highest length. And so that had to be then met with and faced by the society, that is this how we want to live? Now, in present day, caste is something that is considered an illegal classification. And yet, Marquita, here is the sad truth, that every Sunday somebody puts out an ad in the newspaper saying, we'd like people to, who are interested in marrying our son or daughter, matrimonials, and class and caste are very prominently stated. We want a person of our caste to marry our son or daughter. And yet at the same time you have the government saying that you cannot discriminate against anyone based on their caste. So it's a strange position in society.
Well, that's just to point out that the government says you can't do it for legal purposes, but for social purposes you certainly can. Yes. I like the fact that you said that, well, in the United States, the only actual class that we have that's identified legally is poverty. The federal government tells us every year, they give us an amount of money in terms of what 4 people should be able to live off of. And in these last few years, it's been between 21 and 23,000 a year that 4 people should be able to live on for a year. And of course, we know in San Jose, wow, 20,000, that's 4 people, they're starving. In the United States, class is not something that is designated by money. Studies carried out by the U.S. government and other think tanks tell us that the income gap in America is widening and has been widening since 1970. We now have the greatest difference between incomes among Americans since 1970. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and we see that report with every census. It means that some people are suffering in terms of having the basics, while others have more than they need. And this is the thing that we talk about in America, because we say individuality, you can get as much money as you can, which is exactly right. But we also really have to think about having a country where we have many people who don't have what they need. And of course, since 2008, the middle class has been eroded by the, we don't want to call it a depression. What are we calling it?
I think the Great Recession.
The Great Recession.
The Great Recession.
Yes.
Yes.
But the middle class is eroding. Since 1980, during President Reagan's era, money for student loans has been reduced by 30 to 40%. So we have more middle class students who are not able to come to college because there's less college money. So we can talk about that as a reality. Now, we also want to talk about income equality because it makes a difference in the lived experience, and that's what we want to be concerned about. For example, it makes a difference in the quality of education, because education in the United States is funded by property taxes. Children who live in neighborhoods where people don't own property end up having poor quality schools, not because the teachers are not good, that's never the issue, but because they don't have the resources, they have overcrowding, they have violence. Those are the things that are going on. So the educational experience is different. The jobs are different in terms of your socioeconomic level, what kind of jobs you might be introduced to as a child, what kind of jobs you might know about. Housing, of course, the amount of money that you make determines what kind of housing you have, or if you have housing. We know that 1/3 of the people who are living on the street now are women with children, people who are homeless, because women make less money. The lifespan even can be determined by how much money you have. If you're poor and not necessarily have access to health care, and that's why the health care initiative has been so important, your lifespan may be cut by 10 years due to differences in income. And lastly, and so important, dreams. The class that you are in and the opportunities that you have can shape the very vision of the future. Children who are poor tend to stay in poverty. That's one of the things that keeps people in poverty, lack of ability to dream beyond that. Although I grew up poor financially, I grew up in a house where my grandmother had a dream that everybody would go to college. That's a middle class dream. And because she had that dream, we managed, all of her children, all of her grandchildren went to college, even though we were poor. We found a way to do it. Why? Because we could dream it. So the socioeconomic level that you live in can even reduce your dreams. And if you can't dream, you can't move forward. So we've got to be very careful about making sure that at least all of our children have the minimum, they have the floor of what they need to succeed and dream. That's what's going to make our country strong in the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. So well said. And you know, Marquita, this is something that I came across when I worked with some at-risk youth several years ago. I worked for them. They were supposed to be under the Schwarzenegger plan, CalGRIP. And so these were people who were gang-related. They had, some of them were orphaned, some of them from foster care. Very, very challenging students. And again, somewhat similar to a story you told earlier, I was not prepared to teach these students, but no one else would do it. And I was in a community college and I decided, well, so be it. I'll take it on. And what we learned was that they were suffering from something that has just been given a name by a study done in the New York Times. And the name is called toxic stress. It's very, what you basically gave is the typology of toxic stress. You're always in this consistently challenging crisis moment where one day your car is broken, you can't get to work, and you're stressed out that you'll be fired for that. You can't get internet access, so you can't do your homework, so you fail the class. Everything else is going well, but all of a sudden, your youngest sibling or close friend is in trouble medically and with the law, and then you're the only person who can be responsible for that. Again, you miss work or you miss school. You might be the only breadwinner in your entire family and everybody is dependent on you. One of my students told me that she was barely 20 years of age, and she had a part-time job. Her significant other was dependent on her, her siblings were dependent on her, and her mother was dependent on her. And so what these give rise to daily crises, not just challenges, but utter crises where everything can fall apart. As you talked earlier, housing, food, day-to-day food is this constant worry. How am I going to get my next meal? How am I going to keep my roof over my head? And this is why, even though so many students, so many young people, so many older people make that first step and say, okay, I'll better my life, I'll get a college degree, it is so difficult for them to actually make that happen, to actually finish the degree, to get possibly a job after that, which is no guarantees in today's economy, and to actually move up in their income and class level. And maybe you could tell us, Marquita, about how this relates to Maslow's hierarchy.
We've talked about Maslow's hierarchy before in our first show, I think, and it has to do with looking at categories of needs of all human beings. And the first level of need is physiological, where it suggests that human beings need certain things to exist physically. They need food, they need shelter, they need clean water. Second level, security. They need to be safe from harm, psychologically, physically, economically. And when people don't have those first two basic needs met, they cannot move to self-actualization. And that's where we want everybody to be moving toward. So if you have food insecurity, in fact, we have that going on college campuses right now. We actually have students on campuses who are hungry. I have students who came here this summer without computer access, who actually don't own computers, or they live somewhere where they don't have computer access, and yet they have to do things on the computer to be ready for school. So when we don't have those basic needs met, then it's much more difficult for people to become upwardly mobile. And after all, America is a country where you're supposed to be able to be upwardly mobile, and that's what we want to have. So we do want to be aware that class exists, and we want to be aware that class distinctions cut across racial lines. We have poor white people just like we have poor black people. And we need to recognize that, because everybody needs to be supported. And sometimes when we ghettoize, it's the term, we ghettoize a problem and say, oh, that's only about black people, or that's only about women, or that's only about Asian people. Then people tend to think, well, that's not about me. I don't need to be worried about that. But the fact is that poverty cuts across lines. People of all colors, every gender, all of that can be poor, and it harms them. So we want to be aware of class distinctions.
Absolutely, and so well said. And I think you already pushed us into the right direction when it comes to solutions. So much of what you said is true regarding support. Folks, there's so many studies, study after study, that people who are finally able to pull themselves out of a difficult place through positive circumstances and their own self-effort, whenever they look back and they tell someone their story, the most common thing they cite was one older person who was their mentor, be it a family member, be it a teacher, or be it a college or school counselor that said, you can achieve this dreamlike goal of being an astronaut or an engineer or something that for their level of society is incredibly difficult, right? And so aspirations and giving people that certain achievability, giving them that confidence that they have the actual ability to achieve that aspiration is essential to a healthy and progressive society.
Absolutely, yes.
A statement made around, I believe, World War II by Mahatma Gandhi. And the thing he said, I forget the exact words, but to paraphrase, he said how the weapons of war, bombs and missiles and guns, can cause untold damage in a minute, but that damage is visible. It is accepted, it is seen, it is recognized by everyone. But what he said and what he asked us to keep in mind was economic damages, economic weapons, whether it's exploitative by colonial powers or much more subtle and everyday by other strong economic powers within a society. They cause far more invisible wounds and invisible damage and death than any weapon of mass destruction could achieve. And so I think it's good for us to remember, just because you can't see someone in pain doesn't mean they're not. With that, folks, thanks again for joining us for another episode. Do feel free to like this, subscribe to our channel. If you have some thoughts, comment on the comment section below. Hey, and we're on Twitter. Follow us and tweet us at @CultureChatShow, and join us next time for another Culture Chat.